Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Chain Lightning Sorcerer build in Season 5. With this build you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards and destroy Uber Lilith. This build has really high survivability and can easily stagger bosses in seconds. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 8 Infernal Horde solo. I can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes, but it is a lot faster if you clear tier 7 Infernal Hordes. This build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and quickly stagger and melt bosses. Now in order to do damage with this build, you need as much mana regeneration as possible. If you're lacking in mana regeneration, your damage will drop off drastically as this build drains a lot of mana. You will also need to fully masterwork your gear in order to easily clear the highest level content in the game. This build can easily clear tier 101 plus pits and destroy Uber Lilith. With this build you can always have your ultimate skill Unstable Currents active all the time. Now this build does slightly suffer when it comes to single target damage, but this build is very easy to make. Now I'm going to show you a build with Uber uniques and a build without Uber uniques, and you don't need any Ubers to do the hardest content in the game. What's more important than Ubers is masterworking your gear to greatly increase your stats, your damage, and survivability. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. So next for the skills. Now the core skill for this build is Chain Lightning, and this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will shoot a stream of lightning that deals damage to an enemy and chains between nearby enemies. We need to pair this skill with the unique pants, the Axial Conduit, to greatly increase our damage, and this skill can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses. Now because we are pairing the skill with the unique pants, this skill will drain a lot of mana, so you need to build a lot of mana regeneration with this build. The next skill I'm using is the ultimate skill Unstable Currents. And when this skill is active, you'll cast tons of shock skills when you cast the shock skill. This skill will easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses in seconds. And by building a lot of lucky hit chance and the legendary aspect, the aspect of Orange Herald, you can have this ultimate skill active all the time. The next skill I'm using is Lightning Spear, and this skill will conjure a spear of lightning that seeks out and damages enemies. When Lightning Spear critically strikes an enemy, it will apply vulnerable and stun the enemy. This skill is really good for survivability by stunning all the enemies around you. The next skill I'm using is Ice Armor, and this skill is a really strong barrier skill that is really good for survivability, and you will reduce Ice Armor's cooldown the more mana you spend. And since Chain Lightning drains a lot of mana and this build has a lot of mana regeneration, you can have Ice Armor active all the time. The next skill I'm using is Flame Shield, and this is a barrier skill that will make you completely immune to damage and burning surrounding enemies. Now I mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects, because in the highest tier Infernal Hordes there will be a lot of enemies that can crowd control you. And the last skill I'm using is Teleport, and this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. This skill will also make you unstoppable, allowing you to break out of crowd control effect, which is really important in the highest tier Infernal Hordes. Okay, so next for the enchantments. Now the first enchantment I'm using is the Firebolt enchantment, and this enchantment will apply burning damage to our skills. Allowing our skills to do burning damage will pair with our gear and some other skills on the skill tree to greatly increase our damage. The next enchantment I'm using is the Ice Blades enchantment, and with this enchantment you will spawn an Ice Blade on a random enemy for every 40 seconds in cooldown you spend. And since we are using almost all cooldown skills, you can have tons of Ice Blades on the field. Now Ice Blades will do cold damage, which will greatly increase our damage because of our gear and other skills. Ice Blades will also reduce the cooldown of our other skills when Ice Blades hits a vulnerable enemy, making this enchantment really strong. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now I have tested many combinations of skills in the skill tree and concluded that this skill tree layout is the best when it comes to damage and survivability with this build. And I'll have the full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the basic skills, I put 2 points into Firebolt, and this is just for the Firebolt enchantment to apply burning damage to our skills. And doing burning damage will pair with our gear and some other skills on the skill tree to greatly increase our damage. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Chain Lightning, a point into Enhanced Chain Lightning, and a point into Greater Chain Lightning. And this is our main damage dealing skill that does tons of damage. Now pairing this skill with the unique pants, the Axial Conduit, will greatly increase this skill's damage, but in return you will drain tons of mana. Next I put 1 point into Devastation and 3 points into Elemental Dominance, and this skill will greatly increase your core skill's damage. Next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Flame Shield, and this is a barrier skill that will make you completely immune to damage and burning surrounding enemies. Now this skill will be mainly used to break out of crowd control effects, because in the highest tier Infernal Hoards, there will be a lot of enemies that can crowd control you. Next, I put 1 point into teleport, a point into enhanced teleport, and a point into shimmering teleport. And this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. This skill will also make you unstoppable, allowing you to break out of crowd control effects. Next, I put 1 point into ice armor, a point into enhanced ice armor, and a point into shimmering ice armor. And this skill is a really strong barrier skill that is good for survivability. And you will reduce ice armor's cooldown the more mana you spend. And because this build drains tons of mana and it has tons of mana regeneration, you can have ice armor active all the time. Next, I put 1 point into elemental attunement, and this will give you a chance to reset one of your defensive skills when one of your skills critically strikes an enemy. And then I put 3 points into glass cannon, and this skill will greatly increase your damage, but in return you will take more damage. Next, for the conjuration skills, I put 1 point into ice blades, a point into enhanced ice blades, and a point into summoned ice blades. And this skill is used for the ice blades enchantment, and this enchantment will spawn ice blades on a random enemy for every 40 seconds in cooldown you spend. And since we are using almost all cooldown skills, you can have tons of ice blades on the field. Now, ice blades will do cold damage, which will greatly increase our damage because of our gear and other skills. And ice blades will also reduce the cooldown of our other skills when ice blades hits a vulnerable enemy, making this enchantment really strong. Next, I put 1 point into lightning spear, a point into enhanced lightning spear, and a point into invoke lightning spear. And this skill will conjure a spear of lightning that seeks out and damages enemies. When lightning spear critically strikes an enemy, it will apply vulnerable and stun the enemy. This skill is really strong and good for survivability by stunning all the enemies around you. And next, I put 3 points into conjuration mastery, and this skill will increase your damage, movement speed, and mana regeneration for each active conjuration. And since this build summons a lot of conjurations, this skill will greatly increase your damage and mana regeneration. And next, I put 3 points into precision magic, and this skill will greatly increase your lucky hit chance. And lucky hit chance is important for this build. We need lucky hit chance to regenerate mana, apply crowd control effects to enemies, and to reduce the cooldown of the ultimate skill. And then I put 1 point into align the elements, 3 points into mana shield, and 3 points into protection. And these skills are really good for survivability. Next, for the mastery skills, I put 1 point into inner flames and 3 points into devouring blaze. And this skill will greatly increase your critical strike damage against burning enemies. Next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into unstable currents and a point into prime unstable currents. And when this skill is active, you'll cast tons of shock skills when you cast the shock skill. This skill will easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses in seconds. And this skill will also increase your attack speed while active. And by building a lot of lucky hit chance and the legendary aspect, the aspect of the orange herald, you can have this ultimate skill active all the time. Next, I put 1 point into coursing currents and 3 points into electrocution. And with this skill, enemies will do less damage to you when you critically strike them with your shock skills. And then I put 1 point into convulsion, and this skill will give your shock skills a chance to stun enemies, which is really good for crowd control. And next, I put 3 points into fiery surge, and this skill will greatly increase your mana regeneration when you kill a burning enemy. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put 1 point into buyer's mastery, and this states when you critically strike an enemy with a shock skill, you become charged and take 25% less damage for 5 seconds. While charged, critical strikes have a 10% chance to cause the damage to arc as lightning damage to another nearby enemy, or if there are no other targets, you hit the target again for 250% of the damage. And this key passive will greatly increase your defense and survivability whenever you critically strike an enemy with your shock skills. And you also have a chance to do tons of lightning damage to groups of enemies when you critically strike an enemy with your shock skills. Okay, so that's the full skill tree layout for this build to easily destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses while having tons of survivability. And I'll have this full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now, since this is an endgame build, ideally you would want to use Uber Uniques with this build. However, I'll also provide alternate gear options if you don't have access to any Uber Uniques. It's important to note that you don't need any Uber Uniques to tackle the hardest content in the game, as masterworking is more crucial for significantly boosting your stats, damage, and survivability. Additionally, I've created 2 different layouts in the D4 build planner in the description below, one with Uber Uniques and one without Uber Uniques. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the Endariel's Visage, and this is an Uber unique helmet that has pretty good stats with all stats, attack speed, and life on hit. But the main reason we are using this Uber unique helmet is because of the unique aspect, which states lucky hit, up to a 20% chance to trigger a poison nova that applies 132,360 poison damage over 5 seconds to enemies in the area. And this unique aspect will greatly increase the damage we deal. This build does slightly suffer when doing single target damage, so this unique aspect will help with dealing tons of damage. Now, you can can use the Shaco Uber Unique Helmet in the early stages if you need more survivability, because the Shaco does increase your damage reduction. But eventually you'll need the extra damage from Endariel's Visage to quickly destroy bosses, especially when doing tier 8 Infernal Hoards. Okay, so next for the chest piece. I'm using the Tyrael's Might Uber Unique chest piece, and this chest piece is really strong for survivability. The chest piece will give you movement speed, increase your maximum resistance, and gives you tons of damage reduction. And the unique aspect states, while at full life, your skills unleash a Divine Barrage, dealing 5,736 damage. Now the unique aspect is okay for clearing trash enemies, but the main reason we're using this chest piece is for the stats, which you are gaining strong defense and survivability. Next for the gloves, I'm using the unique gloves Fist of Fate, and these gloves will give you attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and lucky hit, up to a 57.6% chance to apply a random crowd control effect for 2 seconds. And the unique aspect states, your attacks randomly deal 1% to 270% of their normal damage. Now these gloves are really strong to easily stagger bosses and to greatly increase your lucky hit chance, and building high lucky hit chance is important for this build. Next for the pants, I'm using the unique pants, the Axial Conduit, and these unique pants are really important for this build to greatly increase your Chain Lightning's damage. Now these unique pants will give you a chance for your Chain Lightning projectiles to cast twice, damage reduction, resource regeneration, and maximum resource, and plus ranks to Chain Lightning. And the unique aspect states, Chain Lightning alternates between orbiting you and seeking up to 3 enemies. When it returns, it drains 6 mana from you for each active Chain Lightning. After draining 66 total mana, the bolt explodes for 26,472 lightning damage. Chain Lightning expires if you don't have enough mana for it to drain. So these unique pants will greatly increase your Chain Lightning's damage, but in return it will drain tons of mana. So you will need to build a lot of mana regeneration for this build. Next for the boots, the stats I have is intelligence, mana per second, and armor. Now depending on what piece of gear you're using, you can replace the armor stats with like movement speed. But if you're using the same exact pieces of gear I'm using right now, then you will need armor on your boots to cap out your armor. And for the tempering stats, I have movement speed and crowd control duration. And the legendary aspect states, lucky hit, up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. Can only happen once per skill cast. And this legendary aspect is important to always have your ultimate skill Unstable Currents active all the time, and the reason we need to build lucky hit chance with this build. Next for the weapon, I'm using a two-handed staff, and the stats I have is intelligence, resource cost reduction, and lucky hit, up to a 5% chance to restore 37.4 primary resource. And the lucky hit chance to restore primary resource is very important for this build to easily regain mana, and the reason we need to build lucky hit chance. And for the tempering, I have vulnerable damage and chance for Chain Lightning projectiles to cast twice. Now you want vulnerable damage over critical strike damage with this build, because the poison damage from the Uber Unique Helmet, the Endariel's Visage, cannot crit and won't do extra damage from critical strike damage, but will do more damage from vulnerable damage. And the legendary aspect states, you deal 60% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. And because this build you will always have a barrier active, this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. Next for the amulet, you're looking for resource cost reduction, plus ranks to Conjuration Mastery, and plus ranks to Glass Cannon. And for the tempering, I have movement speed and resource cost reduction. And the legendary aspect states, each time Chain Lightning bounces, gain 4.5 mana. And this legendary aspect is important for mana regeneration, because we will have tons of Chain Lightnings active on the field. Next for the rings. Now the first ring I'm using is the unique ring, the Taurasha's ring. And this ring has lucky hit chance and cooldown reduction. And the unique aspect states, for each type of elemental damage you deal, gain 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 80%. Dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. And we can easily max out this unique aspect's damage, because we can easily apply lightning, cold, and fire damage. And we're also getting poison damage from the Uber Unique Helmet, the Endariel's Visage. And this unique ring will greatly increase your damage. For the second ring, I'm using the Ring of Starless Skies. And this is a Uber unique ring with really good stats, having attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and plus ranks to core skills. And the unique aspect states, spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of your skills and increase your damage by 10% for 3 seconds, up to 50%. So this Uber unique ring is overall really strong and will greatly increase your damage. Okay, now I'll share some alternate gear if you don't have any Uber uniques. So for the helmet, you're looking for a helmet like this with mana per second and cooldown reduction. And the legendary aspect states, you take 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. For the chest piece, you're looking for intelligence and mana per second. And the legendary aspect states, the Vire's Mastery key passive also grants 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. And for the gloves, you're looking for attack speed, critical strike chance, and plus ranks to Chain Lightning. And the legendary aspect states, Ice Blaze chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%. And the vulnerable vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds. You gain 30% vulnerable damage. And for the ring, you want to get attack speed and critical strike chance. And for the legendary aspect, it states you deal 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. So even with these legendary gear, you can easily clear the highest level content in the game. Just make sure to masterwork your gear, as it's crucial for significantly boosting your stats. I also created 2 different layouts in a D4 build planner in the description below, one with Uber uniques and one without Uber uniques. And really quickly for the gems, for the armor pieces, I'm using ruby gems to greatly increase my maximum life. For the weapon, I'm using sapphire gems to greatly increase my vulnerable damage. And it's important to prioritize boosting vulnerable damage over critical strike damage, especially if you're using the Uber unique helmet, the Endariel's Visage. This is because vulnerable damage will enhance the poison damage from the Uber unique helmet, whereas critical strike damage will not. And for the jewelry, you want to use gems that either cap out your armor or elemental resistance. So with the Uber unique chest piece, Tyrael's Might, which easily caps out my elemental resistance, I'm using skull gems to cap out my armor. However, if your armor is already capped out from your other pieces of gear, then focus on using gems to cap out your elemental resistance instead. And if you check out my stats, my armor stat is at 9,458, which is above the armor cap at 9,230. And if you check out my resistance, all my elemental resistance is capped out. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board. And this is a fully optimized Paragon Board at level 100. And with this Paragon Board, I did take 8 glyphs to maximize my damage and survivability. Now, I'm just going to quickly go over this Paragon Board, going over the important nodes and glyphs. But I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I'm using the Elementalist glyph. And additional bonus states, dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage you deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. And we can easily max out this bonus because this build can deal fire, cold, and lightning damage. The next Paragon Board I'm using is Static Surge, and the glyph I'm using is Destruction. And additional bonus states, critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from you by 2% for 10 seconds up to 12%. And this glyph will greatly increase your damage when you critically strike enemies. I also took the legendary node Static Surge, which states after spending 57 mana, your next cast of Chain Lightning or Charged Bolts makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds and restores 10% of your mana. The mana cost requirement is reduced by the mana cost reduction bonus. And since this build has some mana cost reduction bonus, the mana cost requirement is reduced. And this legendary node is really strong to easily apply vulnerable to enemies and also really good for mana regeneration. Then heading left this way. And the next Paragon Board I took is Frigid Fate. And the glyph I'm using is Control. An additional bonus states you deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And with this build, you can easily stun enemies and stagger bosses, so this glyph will greatly increase your damage. I also took the legendary node Frigid Fate, which states you deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total amount of your bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 60%. Now, even though we're not focusing on building cold damage, this build does have a lot of non-physical damage, which is considered cold damage as well. And we can easily cap out this legendary node. As you can see, my current bonus is at 60%. You also want to take these rare nodes, Oppressive and Guarded, to gain damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, which will greatly increase your survivability. Then heading right this way. And the next Paragon Board I'm using is Enchantment Master, and the glyph I'm using is Unleash. And additional bonus states, after spending 50 mana, you deal 8% increased damage and gain 25% increased mana regeneration for 3 seconds. Now this glyph is really strong to greatly increase your damage and mana regeneration. You also want to take this rare node Ruinous to greatly increase your non-physical damage. Then heading up this way. And the next Paragon Board I'm using is Burning Instinct, and the glyph I'm using is Tactician. An additional bonus states you deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. This duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on your action bar, and this glyph will greatly increase your damage after using a defensive skill. Then heading left this way. And the next Paragon Board I'm using is Searing Heat, and the glyph I'm using is Exploit. And the additional bonus states dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%, and this glyph will greatly increase your damage when you deal damage to vulnerable enemies. Then heading up this way. And the next Paragon Board I'm using is Ceaseless Conduit, and the glyph I'm using is Territorial. And additional bonus states you gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies, and this glyph is really good for defense and survivability. Then heading left this way. And the last Paragon Board I'm using is Elemental Summoner, and the glyph I'm using is Reinforced. And additional bonus states you gain 15% damage reduction while you have an active barrier. And since with this build you can always have ice armor active all the time, this glyph will greatly increase your survivability survivability. Okay, so that's a fully optimized Paragon board at level 100 for this build. And you want to get your glyphs to at least level 15 plus to be able to get the additional bonuses on your glyphs. And like I mentioned before, I'll have this full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Chain Lightning Sorcerer build in Season 5. With this build, you can easily clear Tier 8 Infernal Hoards and destroy Uber Lilith. This build has really high survivability and can easily stagger and shred bosses in seconds. And I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,